The husband said.
How much is your father's retirement payout?
What? It's zero. There's no retirement payout, I replied, and my husband snorted and continued further.
I don't want to pay for your parents' nursing home expenses.
He said, demanding a divorce from me. I'm Kate, and I'm turning 33 this year. I got married to Charles when I was 23. At that time, I was working as an office clerk in the fashion industry. I met Charles at a party that was organized by mutual friends. He was 4 years older than me, and to me, he seemed very mature. He knew a lot of great restaurants and was knowledgeable about wines. I wanted to be a woman worthy of Charles, and I might have been trying a little too hard. 8 months into our relationship, he proposed, and we decided to visit each other's parents to make introductions. I was thrilled at the prospect of becoming Charles's wife. On the day of our visit to my parents' house, Charles was nervous as we approached. I noticed that there was an unusual commotion at the front entrance. As we got closer, I saw my father being supported by 2 young people on each side.
See, didn't I tell you? Mr. David, please don't overexert yourself. That's right. You're getting older, you know.
The youngsters were throwing words at him one after another. I had seen this scene several times before. Whenever my father injured his back while working, these youngsters always saw him safely home.
No, I'm not giving up yet. Ouch.
Come on, your body hasn't given in yet.
The young ones were comforting my father, who was trying to be tough. Despite their rough language, both of them were clearly looking out for my father, paying close attention to his expressions. Charles stood behind them, raising his hands in front of him, appearing flustered. He must have been trying to offer some help. Dad. What's wrong?
Oh, Kate. I just have a bit of back pain.
When I called out to him, my father casually said it, but given the situation, it seemed a bit unrealistic.
Mr. David, he got a slipped disc at the worksite. Even though we said we'd handle it.
As the youngsters said this, they helped my father sit down at the entrance step. When my father assumed a seated position, his face contorted even more. It seemed quite painful. In the midst of this, Charles, hesitating slightly, spoke to my father.
Nice to meet you. Are you okay?
No, it's not a big deal. You must be Charles, right? You've come all this way, and now you've seen me in this sorry state. Well, please come inside. Ouch.
Despite it being Charles's first visit to our home, my father had injured his back at the construction site and had to be escorted home by a young worker. He might have been in a hurry to make it home on time as per the appointment, but I felt embarrassed that Charles had seen my father in such a state. Charles, while showing concern for my father's condition, continued the conversation, and both my parents took a liking to Charles. I'm sorry about today. I made you worry, didn't I?
No, it's all right. Your dad seems lively.
Charles said so and smiled. Seeing that smile, I felt a little relieved. Yeah, that's right. Dad really enjoys working with the young guys. I might be causing them a bit of trouble though.
Being a carpenter must take a toll on the body at your dad's age, right?
Yeah, that's true. But it seems like he loves the job site. Afterwards, we also went to Charles's parents' house to introduce ourselves, but it was completely different from my own family's atmosphere. His father was a banker, and his mother was a homemaker. The sparsely furnished living room had no sense of everyday life, it was a stylish space. Both of his parents had gentle manners. I understood that Charles had been raised in this calm atmosphere. I couldn't help but wonder what Charles thought when he came to my family's home, but I decided not to ask. I quit my job as soon as we got married and became a homemaker. Then, 3 years later, I became pregnant and gave birth to a baby boy. We had chosen the name Chris together from the moment we found out the gender. However, Charles became increasingly busy with work around the time I got pregnant with Chris, and I couldn't get much help with childcare. But when he came home, he was always kind and attentive.
I'm sorry for always making you feel lonely. Since marrying you, my career has been going really well. I feel fulfilled, and you are my goddess.
Charles would say such words to me. I did worry about his busy schedule, but when he said things like that with a big smile on his face, I felt happy too. On weekends, he would play with Chris and occasionally surprise me with small gifts. I could feel Charles's love wholeheartedly. On my birthday, he would come home early with a cake, champagne, and a gift. We would raise our champagne glasses together, and it made me feel like we had stepped up to a higher level of life. But by the time Chris turned 5, those things had changed. He still remembered my birthday, but he would say,
"Pick something you like, and I'll buy it for you."
On weekends, he would insist on resting and spend the day lounging around. Maybe that's just how married life is, I thought. However, I wished he would at least spend time with Chris. When Chris would approach him to play, Charles would say,
"Daddy's tired, so could you go to mommy for a bit?"
Chris would nod quietly and sit down next to me, looking disappointed. At that moment, I received a phone call from my father. This day would be the day when I would come to know Charles's true feelings. My father spoke loudly, asking if it was okay for him to come by since he was nearby, and his voice could be heard clearly by both Charles and Chris. Upon hearing this, Chris was overjoyed. Charles quickly got up and started fixing his hair. A few minutes later, my father appeared, and Chris ran over to greet him.
Grandpa.
Chris, you've gotten so big. Ha ha ha.
Just by walking in through the front door, the atmosphere in our home changes completely.
Charles, I'm sorry for intruding on your day off. I'll be leaving soon.
No, it's absolutely fine. Please, take your time.
My father engaged with Chris with so much enthusiasm that it seemed like they were kids playing together. Chris burst into laughter, and Charles watched with a forced smile. Come to think of it, I couldn't recall Charles ever playing wholeheartedly with Chris. It must have been about an hour when my father, after thoroughly rolling around and playing with Chris, decided it was time to leave. At that moment, Chris's expression suddenly turned lonely.
Grandpa, are you leaving already?
Oh, Chris. I actually have some errands to run after this. I just stopped by because I wanted to see your face. I'll come again.
Ah, come on. Can I go play at Grandpa's house later?
It seemed like Chris wanted to go home with my father, and he was lingering by the front door. When my father's figure disappeared, Chris started sniffling. The living room, now devoid of my father, fell into silence. Charles had stopped his forced smile and appeared visibly displeased.
Your father-in-law is always so energetic, isn't he?
Yeah, he's been like that for a long time. Sorry about that. It's your day off, and it got noisy.
I guess he has good stamina. Being a carpenter involves physical labor. Mental and physical fatigue are different in quality.
Charles sighed and said that, then lay down on the living room sofa. What's that?
Well, even if I tell you, you wouldn't understand. After all, you're just a homemaker and don't have to think about anything.
What do you mean by anything? I stopped responding further. My father, who worked as a carpenter, and I, a homemaker, may not have been thinking about the same things. I never expected Charles to have such thoughts. My father originally started in the scaffolding team at a construction company and has since risen to a managerial position. Nevertheless, he often visits the construction sites to work alongside the young craftsmen and personally engage with each employee. It was disappointing to think that I had looked down on my father simply for being a carpenter, and I felt there was no need to reveal the truth. After that, our home became even quieter. Charles stopped even talking to Chris. It seemed like he didn't like how close Chris had become to his grandfather. I then began to emulate my father and interacted with Chris from a child's perspective. I wanted to help ease Chris's loneliness. I felt ashamed of myself for feeling embarrassed about my father. I used to love him so much. During that time, the regular dinners with Charles's parents had become nothing but a source of discomfort. While my in-laws were always gentle and kind to me, the topics of conversation revolved around other people's alma maters, professions, incomes, and other people's marriages and divorces. I found it all irrelevant. One day, Charles came home looking grumpy. He was sighing and clicking his tongue, clearly quite frustrated. I was surprised because Charles usually didn't express his emotions so openly.
Honestly, your father is quite a handful.
What? Is something wrong with my father?
I don't want him to casually approach me. It's embarrassing.
Saying that, Charles directed a surprisingly cold expression at me. I was unsettled by Charles's face, one that I had never seen before. What do you mean by embarrassing?
Today, I was heading to an important client meeting with the branch manager. We parked the car and were walking together when your father-in-law appeared.
Charles spat out those words, roughly removed his tie, and flung it onto the sofa. He was sitting on the ground with some young guy, eating lunch together, and there was a dispute over the fried chicken from the young guy's lunch that your father-in-law apparently ate. They were making a big fuss about it, screaming and shouting. It's not like he's a child. That sounds like something my father would do. He tends to encourage young employees and is always making a ruckus with everyone. It seems like Charles tried to pass by without being noticed by my father, but my father spotted him and called out to him.
I was with the branch manager over here. We have a major contract coming up. I was feeling tense. And then, he asks, work? Do your best. It's not a do your best situation, you know?
My father didn't know what Charles was going through, so you didn't need to get so angry.
It's embarrassing to have a guy who's eating lunch on the ground as my relative. I told him not to casually approach me.
Charles continued to speak with excitement. Essentially, he seemed to want to convey that his father, the carpenter, and himself were different levels of people. And he felt embarrassed to introduce his father to the branch manager.
I've been putting up with it all this time. I didn't like him from the first time we met.
Really? You've been thinking that since the first time you met him?
That's right. He'll be retiring in a few years, right? How much retirement money will he receive?
He suddenly started talking about retirement benefits, so I was confused. Charles's words about not liking him from the first time we met still had my head spinning, and I couldn't understand why he was bringing up such a topic now. Huh? Retirement benefits? There aren't any. It's zero, you know.
If there's no retirement benefits, what are you going to do in your old age? You're not going to rely on me, right? I absolutely don't want us to live together, and I don't want to pay for your parents' nursing home either.
Given that he brought up the topic of retirement benefits in this situation, he must have always been thinking about such things while looking at my father. I started feeling somewhat pathetic. Furthermore, Charles continued.
I don't want anything to do with you in the future. I don't need your family in my future. Let's get a divorce right now. Being associated with you all is affecting my job.
Why would something like this lead to a divorce? I refused the divorce. From that day on, Charles began to complain about my father. I tried to be patient for Chris' sake. However, Chris looked at Charles with sadness as he spoke ill of his grandfather, and I myself felt the limits of my life with Charles, who made fun of my father. Afterwards, I decided to divorce Charles. Neither of our parents opposed it. It was difficult to tell my father about the circumstances of the divorce, but he listened silently. After returning to my parents' house, my quiet daily life changed completely. When my father came home from work, he played with Chris and rolled around with him. When he brought young craftsmen home, they joined in and played with Chris, making it very noisy. Chris laughed and rolled around in the midst of it all. He became talkative and bright. My mother likes to serve food to everyone, so my father's friends often gather at our house. The house is comfortable, but the constant coming and going of people makes it hard to relax. Eventually, I started working to start a life with Chris. My parents helped me in many ways when I started working again after a long time. I felt my father's warmth again at home. On that day, I learned that I was always being watched over by two fathers. The construction company where my father worked was locally based and had deep connections with local landlords. Even the landlords, including the company's president, would occasionally gather at my father's place for drinks. On that day, several people had gathered and started drinking. One of the landlords had mentioned that he had to cancel the apartment construction project, but they were discussing the progress of the contract when they had gathered. The president and my father nodded and said, "It's okay, go ahead." However, they both suddenly stopped saying those words. They didn't say anything negative, but the landlord who had become anxious ended up canceling the apartment construction project. The president and my father are highly trusted by the landlords. When landlords such as housemakers, salespeople visited, they would consult with the president and my father and decide what to do based on their reaction. I was surprised by the influence of the president and my father. One landlord canceled the apartment construction project, and another landlord who seemed to be his friend also said he would stop talking to the housemaker. The landlord who had canceled the contract had planned to build an apartment with the housemaker where Charles worked, and Charles was in charge of the project. By the way, the president sometimes casually told me about the landlords who were playing with their land. I think I talked to Charles about it. The president and my father have been close friends since long ago, and the president has always treated me like his daughter. On that day, I realized for the first time that the two of them had been supporting my married life behind the scenes. Charles, who didn't know that, became overconfident and began to look down on my father. The president seems to have a friendship with Charles's boss, and after I divorced him, Charles's sales performance stopped growing at all, and he was transferred to an office job and is now looked down upon by young employees. He seems to be clinging to the company anyway. Charles had no real ability. I thanked my father and the president again that day. I decided to work hard so as not to worry them in the future. A few days later, Charles called me. I didn't even want to hear his voice, but my smartphone kept ringing persistently. I reluctantly answered the phone. Then I heard Charles's weak voice.
How are you? I regret it. I'm really sorry. I want to start over with Kate.
What are you talking about now?
I was out of my mind. I'm really sorry.
Is he feeling uneasy and lonely at work, and that's why he needs me and Chris? But the next moment, he started saying something unbelievable.
I've been renting a monthly apartment until now. I'm moving to a rental apartment next time, but my father-in-law's name is on the contract.
You're going to move into my father's apartment, whom you hate. You can do whatever you want. It's none of my business.
No, I was thinking that if I could start over with Kate, I could help with the apartment management.
What are you talking about?
You know, your father-in-law is getting old and it's tough, right?
I was disgusted. Charles just wanted to be involved in apartment management because he couldn't stand working at his current company. My father inherited 3 apartment buildings from his grandfather. There was no need to worry about Charles's retirement as he claimed. But my father had told me not to talk to Charles about the apartments. Maybe my father had seen through Charles's character early on. I'm disgusted. He looked down on my father so much when he found out he owned the apartments.
No, I was just busy and frustrated.
It's stupid to think that I loved someone like you. Reconciliation is impossible.
Kate. Please, please forgive me.
What are you talking about, that you can help with apartment management? You're not needed. Don't call me again. Charles persisted, but I hung up the phone in the middle of the conversation. He called me a few more times after that, but I ignored him. I blocked Charles's number. 3 months later, I rented an apartment near my parents' house. It's an apartment owned by my father, but I pay the rent properly. Of course, it's a different apartment from where Charles lives. I live happily with my son, going back and forth between my parents' house and my apartment. Later, it seems that Charles was listed as a temporary worker in the occupation column of his rental contract renewal documents. It seems that he quit the housemaker. I don't care where Charles works. As long as he continues to pay child support, that's all that matters to me. Maybe I don't have a good eye for people. If I ever get married again in the future, I'll ask my father or the president for their opinion first.